Welcome to Podcast Answers, the show where I help you start and grow your podcast by answering any questions that you have. So in that, you can watch us live. We record this show live Tuesdays at noon Eastern. You can go to nowstreaming.live and see us do this. You can ask your questions right online, right when we're recording live. So you can actually be part of this show. And we would love to have you be part of the show because it's a lot of fun. You get your podcast questions answered in the comments, and it's great. So that's why I exist. I exist to help people. Well, I don't exist, but the show, the Podcast Answers show, is here to help you start your podcast, grow your podcast, and answer all sorts of podcasting questions. So again, that URL is nowstreaming.live. Tuesdays at noon Eastern is when I record this podcast, so you can be a part of it. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about show notes. What are show notes? So show notes are essentially your blog post to the episode. And what is great about that is it's the way that it's extra notes for your show. So I'm doing this show in audio. You can hear me talk. But if I'm mentioning things, if I'm talking all about different topics and ideas, and I have URLs to go to or pictures to show you. And now pictures I could show you in the YouTube video because I am streaming this live on YouTube as we're recording. But if you have something like a URL, that's really hard to say. So essentially, the show notes are the blog post for your episode, and it is also when you create your episode in your podcast host, it's called the description of your episode, and it shows up in all of the podcast apps. So if you're looking at Apple Podcast right now, or Cast-O-Matic, or CurioCaster, or any of the podcast apps, you're going to see the title, and you're also going to see the description. And the description is that. It's the show notes for your episode. It is what your episode is about. And so what it does is it allows your listeners to know what the episode is about. So if they're just looking at the title of it, they may know, like in this case, this title of this episode is show notes, or something along those lines of how to create great show notes. And so you may know that that's about show notes, but what if it is something less descriptive? Like what if it's just something like, today I interviewed John Smith. Are you actually going to know what that's about? Because you may not even know who John Smith is. So the show notes allow you to say, John Smith is the leading expert about how podcasting works technically in your brain. When you listen to a podcast, what happens in your brain? You can use those things in your show notes, and then people can, as they're looking at your titles, can get a little bit more information about what they're going to be listening to. It also allows you to, again, if you're saying links in your episode, sometimes those are really hard to know, especially if you have something like, let's just say something really, really long. So if it's an episode, or if you're trying to link to something that's like Amazon.com/product/ this is an awesome-product.com, like you're not going to remember that if you're just listening in the car. A lot of times I'm listening to podcasts in the car, and so I don't actually know. I'm not going to sit down and go to that website right away that I want to go to. So what show notes allow you to do is put that URL in your actual podcast app so that way people can find it easier later. Now, I recommend using redirects anyways. So like, for instance, for this podcast, it's podcastanswers.com/buymeacoffee will take you to our Buy Me a Coffee, but I don't want to have to say buymeacoffee.com/podcast answers or something along those lines, because you may not remember what all of those are. So I try to use branded links by using a redirect. So again, I can just tell you to go to podcast answers/buymeacoffee or podcast answers/support or whatever that's going to be kind of branded as me, because it's podcastanswers.com/buymeacoffee. But I also have short links set up for lots of other things too. So just for instance, if you want to learn how to use Ecamm, you can go to podcastanswers.com/Ecamm, ECAMM, and that'll take you to Ecamm. Or if you want to learn all about podcast hosting and you want to check out the podcast host I use, you can use podcastanswers.com/captivate. And so I use all of these really short URLs, these redirects, so I don't need to give you the separate different links that may be longer and harder to remember. I give you those, but I would also, even if I say that in the episode, so I may say, like I just did there, podcastanswers.com/buy me a coffee. Now, I said it a couple times, so hopefully you actually remember it. But what if you don't? Like, what if you're driving and you're like, hey, I remember on the episode about show notes, Andy talking something about buy me a coffee or support, or I can't remember what it is. You know the episode you were listening to. You knew it was the episode about show notes. And so all you have to do is open up your podcast app and you can find all of the links in there that I'm talking about. So for instance, what I do is I usually put a paragraph about what the episode is like, what I talked about in the episode. So in this podcast episode, I'm going to say something like, we're talking all about show notes. Show notes give your listeners a way to know what the episode is about, and also how to link to different things that they may be talking about, or something along those lines. I may not use that exact verbiage in for this show note, but I'm going to put a paragraph about what the show notes or what the episode was. And so that gives me the very first thing is going to be what this episode is about. And then for me, what I do is I put links. So I have I start all of my show notes off with like just a regular text. But then after I put what the episode is about, I have like it in a heading format. So I use an H3 specifically. So not all podcast apps are going to display your show notes the same. And it's going to drive you nuts if you try to get all of the podcast apps to display your notes exactly the same or exactly how you want them, because they're not going to do that. But you're going to want to use something like, for those that do use HTML tags, if you put, like I use a heading 3, so it kind of stands out bolder, and I say links. And then the one thing that's important to know about links in your podcast notes is you can, if you know what a hyperlink is, you can, so for instance, that would be something like the text on the page says support. And when you click that link, it takes you to podcastanswers.com/buy me a coffee. I'm going to keep saying that in this episode because it's important. Because that's how I get supported for this episode. So this show, that's how I continue to be able to continue doing it. So I'm going to keep saying it. But not all podcast apps allow you to click the link if it's just a hypertext. And so what I do, a lot of them some of them require what they're calling naked links, and naked links are just that. They're, let's say in this case, podcastanswers.com/buy me a coffee is written out in my show notes text. And so I need to have that as a naked link. So usually for me, what I actually do is I actually will write out something like support the show. And then I put https://podcastanswers.com/buy me a coffee. But then I hyperlink that whole thing. So if the podcast app that you use allows you to do hyperlink text, now you can click on it. If it doesn't, it still has the link there so people can see it. And if it takes the naked link and makes it a link, then great. So that's what I do for my show notes. So I start with the topic of what the show is going to be about. And so I talk a little bit about what the episode is about. And then I talk about the links that I have. And so I am able to easily go in and say, hey, go to the link section of the show notes. Look in the show notes. You'll find the links for this episode. And that may be lots of different things. That may be the link to the YouTube episode, because if you're in a podcast app, you may not even know that I have a YouTube video that for this specific episode. And it may be, let's say I'm talking about support. So buy me a coffee is going to be there. And, all of those things like that. Or if I have a guest on, what I do is I have all of the guest contact information. So for instance, a few weeks ago when I had Todd from Blueberry on, I put blueberry.com in there. I put their link to podcast AI or Pi, their Blueberry Pi, and all sorts of different things I put the links to. So those are the things that we're talking about. But then you can also go and actually link to them. It's going to have a better click through rate. Because again, if people want to get to the website, most people aren't going to type that in their browser. They're going to want to go and click in and find something really easy. And so if you provide that for them in the show notes, then they can get to what they're looking for super, super easy. Now, if you have chapters in your podcast, which I highly recommend. So if you're listening in a lot of podcast apps, if you look down right now, somewhere on the interface, on your podcast interface, there's going to be a chapter. So I usually, for my show, I have a intro, I have a topic, I call it whatever. Like this time I'll talk about chapters. Sometimes if I'm talking about lots of different things or lots of different parts of the show, so like if I was talking about what to put in your show notes, how to do links, I may actually break those out into separate chapters. And chapters are cool because you can skip around. And again, I know a lot of people say, well, I don't want people to skip around in my show. But a lot of times if you're going to, that's the way for it to make it memorable too. Because yes, they may just want to get to the meat and of the show, and that's okay. But if you're talking about lots of different topics and you have them linked lots of different places, you can skip around. So again, if I'm talking just about redirects, then I can skip them to the part about redirects that they want. A lot of times for me, I'm listening to the whole show, but I may be riding in the car and I want to hear something again because I missed it, but it was really a good idea. So for me, I go back and use the chapters and skip to that part that the hosts were talking about, the thing that I actually wanted to listen to and take notes on later when I can. So if you're using chapters in your podcast, which again, I recommend you do, write a full paragraph about each chapter. I've heard it said, Todd from Blueberry says, create your audio for your listeners and your show notes for Google. And so that's a good thing to remember because it allows you to say, okay, I'm doing this audio for you as the listeners, and the show notes are there for you too. I mean, if you want to go back and read them, yeah, that's great. But you really want to invest and put your descriptions in and put some time into that for Google. Don't just do a transcript dump of the podcast. Yes, transcripts are great in podcasts, but don't just do a transcript dump and put that on your show notes. Because it's not going to make sense. Because Google's looking for things like articles and web pages that are written, like the written word, and you don't speak like you write. When you write in a different tone and in a different style. But when you're talking, you say words that you wouldn't say when you're writing. You get to the point your sentence structure is different. So write your show notes for Google because Google is going to index that, and that's how people are actually going to find your episode. They're going to find it because they're listening to you talk about whatever you're talking about. And so in order to find that, Google needs to know where it's at. Because a lot of times I'm going to be searching for a topic on the internet. I may be looking for show notes, how to write show notes for your podcast. And if my podcast episode has great show notes and Google has indexed that, they're going to be able to find my show. You're going to be able to find my show. And so I'll do that. I kind of like to think of show notes like the liner notes on CDs. Now, if you're old enough to remember CDs or cassettes or records or whatever, I would find myself going in to find out more about the song I was listening to. I would find out who wrote it. I'd find out the lyrics, because a lot of times lyrics aren't easy to hear or understand when you're listening to them. Same thing with audio podcasts. Your show notes are kind of like the liner notes for a cassette or a CD. Because you can go back in and you can see the art on them. You can see what the person was talking about. You can link to more details. You get more details. Think of your show notes as a way to enhance your audio episode. Your audio episode is great and has great content, but your show notes enhance that and make that better. So, because people are going to be looking for that. It gives more information about the episode that you were talking about. So, and some people like to learn better by listening and some learn by reading. Provide both. Allow people to go back and remember what you talked about in this episode. I know Daniel from the Audacity podcast does a great job at making his show notes full books. He does a great job at this. If you've never heard his podcast, go check it out, theaudacitytopodcast.com. He does a great job at covering a lot of podcasting topics too. And yes, we're in the same space, and I don't consider him a competitor of mine at all. Like, we're in the same space, and we're trying to just make the podcasting space better. So go check out Daniel's podcast, The Audacity to Podcast. And you'll see, like, he does a great job at writing his show notes like a book. He talks all about everything. He puts everything step by step that he's explaining in there in his show notes. He talks a lot about it. And it's great because you can go back and see what he's talking about, especially if he's talking about code or things that you can do on your website. You may need to see that because it's a visual thing. And so it's best to go back and put all of that information in your show notes. So that way people can go back and get that information and see it and remember it. So guys, I hope this episode was super helpful for you. I hope that you enjoyed listening to it about show notes. I hope you do a great job at show notes. I hope you put the time into there, and so that people can not just listen to your episode, but go back and get all the information that they may have missed when you were talking about whatever topic it was that you were talking about. Now, I've mentioned it several times in this show, and this show is value for value. And essentially what that means is if you've gotten value from this show, please consider giving value back to me. I don't have any sponsors in this show. I don't have anyone that's paying my hosting bills, anything like that. And so if you got any value out of this show, you may pay somebody to talk about podcasting and teach you how to podcast. I'm talking about podcasting here. So if you've got any value out of this show, please consider heading over to podcastanswers.com/support or buy me a coffee. Either one works. And consider giving back what you feel this episode was worth to you. If that was $5, give me $5 back. If it was $10, $10. If it was $500, $500. Whatever it is, it's up to you. But just consider it. If I've given you any value, please consider giving value back to me at podcastanswers.com/support. And again, I do this show live every Tuesday, and come join me live. I would love to have you watch or listen live. We do it in the audio in the New Podcast apps, which you can find at newpodcastapps.com, or you can go to nowstreaming.com. Again, I'm sorry, nowstreaming.live, and we're live every Tuesday at noon. Come join us. Have a great week, guys.